On behalf of RBCS and software test professionals, welcome to this webinar on test strategies, not schools. I'm Rex Black, president of RBCS, a worldwide testing and quality assurance firm serving clients ranging from small startups to Fortune 20 global enterprises. Since 1994, RBCS has delivered insight and confidence to hundreds of clients around the world. Our team of international consultants deliver customized training, consulting, and outsourcing services for companies that are looking to improve their test and quality assurance practices. I am the author of 12 books on software testing, including the bestseller Managing the Testing Process and four books on the ISTQB program. RBCS is presenting this webinar in partnership with software test professionals. Check out their website at www.softwaretestpro.com. Attendance at today's webinar earns PMI PDUs. I would like to thank Linda Thorne for reviewing the materials for PDU status and making valuable suggestions. Attendees will receive an email telling them how to claim PDUs, including the PDU code. PDUs are available for live webinar attendance only. Before we start the presentation, a couple notes. Feel free to submit questions at any time during the presentation via your webinar interface, but please note they are answered only at the end. There is no need to ask for presentation copies. The presentation is already posted on the web, www.rbcs-us.com. Go to the Resources tab, navigate from there to the Basic Library. By attending this webinar, you are automatically registered for the free e-learning drawing, so check your email over the next couple days and watch the spam filter. I hope you enjoy this free webinar from RBCS. We do these free webinars as a service to the software testing community because at RBCS we are a not-just-for-profit company. So today's webinar is on strategies of testing rather than schools, and some of you might have no idea what this is about, but in a matter of moments you will. So this fellow here on the front is Sun Tzu, who is the author of a book called Art of War, written many, many years ago. And notice that this is he's a famous military strategist, and notice that here on the left-hand side of the screen you can see that he is proposing a number of different strategies depending on your situation. So what to do, what the right strategy is, depends on the situation in which you find yourself. So what's wrong with this whole schools of testing idea? So you might or might not be familiar with it, but there was a book written a number of years ago. As I was saying before I was so rudely interrupted by a bug in Citrix software, there was this book written a number of years ago. It was written probably in 2000. I think it was published in 2001. It was called Lessons Learned in Software Testing, and at the end of it, it talked about these different schools of testing and listed 7 principles of what they called the context-driven school. And, if you read the 7 principles, it's, it's okay, but it's kind of common sense for the most part. Some of it's kind of silly, like the no best practices. Well, of course, there are best practices, just if you define best practice to be different than the way that phrase is actually used by the rest of the world, then I guess you could say there aren't any under their definition. But other than that, it was, pretty much a statement of common sense. But if you look at this context-driven testing school concept, take into account what has actually been accomplished. They defined 3 other schools, which everybody else denies being part of. So it sounds like it was more a matter of creating labels that they could hang off of people they disagree with and saying they disagree with them. Okay. This book was the beginning of a fairly significant schism in software testing, which led to these folks who call themselves part of this context-driven school saying that they don't like anybody else's ideas and they don't talk to other people, or well, they do, but most of what they do is yell at other people on Twitter If you were to find any other paper or article written about schools of testing, it will certainly be written by these people who have called themselves context-driven testers, and it will be very negative about the other schools of testing. Ironically enough, in spite of being called context-driven, if you follow some of these folks on Twitter, you will find that they make very prescriptive comments and say, well, you should do this and you shouldn't do that. Lately, they seem to be, for some reason, deciding that the ISO 29119 standard is about to destroy the known universe, or at least the software testing part of it. So they're up in arms about that, even though from what I can tell, it's likely to be fairly innocuous and about as influential as all the other testing standards that have come out. There's been sort of a Tower of Babel problem created by this idea of schools of testing. They recently decided that a term that testing requirements was not going to be called verification anymore. They decided they were going to call it checking, and this is done in a very dismissive fashion, like, oh, you're just checking, you're not actually testing. What they consider testing is what the rest of the world calls validation, and has for many years. The kind of commentary that emanates from a lot of these folks on Twitter is really very dismissive and rude towards anybody else who is not a context-driven tester. And when you listen to them talk about testing, they all pretty much say the same things. They quote the 7 principles, and they say things that are, maybe marginally different, but, it's a fairly echo chamber type of thinking, and I don't think that this has actually advanced us at all in terms of the profession. Brett Petticord, who was one of the co-authors of the book, came out and said schools can be used to dismiss ideas you don't agree with. And to be frank, that's pretty much what I see as the most general use of this. So what I'm suggesting here is that we dismiss the concept of schools as not one that served us well, because what I'd like to suggest is that we instead think about strategy. So there's a couple definitions from dictionary.com. Strategy is a careful plan or method for achieving a particular goal, usually over a long period of time. Okay, so we can have strategy for testing. We can think these things out, figure out what our goals are on this particular goal. And we have a goal, there's something we're trying to accomplish, and we are patient and do this over a period of time. Versus the definition of schools, again, this is not, I didn't make this definition up, came off of dictionary.com. A group of persons who hold a common doctrine or follow the same school or follow the same teacher. Now, if you choose to belong to a school, you're basically, based on that definition above, bound to the doctrines and teachers of that school. So you have to follow along with what they say. Now, instead, if you are choosing strategies, then you choose the strategies that serve your needs and those of your stakeholders. Now, I'm going to suggest that that is a much better way to think of testing, is that we, instead of focusing on doctrines and teachers who, the teachers who may have no experience or knowledge with what we are doing and the problems we're solving, and the doctrines which may have been evolved in situations very different than ours, that instead we acquaint ourselves with a number of strategies, and we use those strategies to serve our own needs and the needs of our stakeholders, since we are probably best positioned to understand those. So what is a test strategy? So test strategy, we can say, is a general project-independent pattern for how testing is done. So it's the way that we get our testing done. And I think if you reflect on the way that you approach testing, you'll probably see that there are some patterns in terms of how you do this, and that those patterns apply over a long period of time, that you tend to approach testing in the same way again and again. And the purpose of this particular session is to give you some ideas about strategies that I've seen in use by test teams around the world and that I've used myself. Any one of these strategies can be useful in the right circumstance. It can also be harmful in the wrong circumstance. So you have to be the judge of when to apply these. There is no teacher. There is no doctrine. There is just your knowledge, skills, experience, wisdom to select the appropriate strategies and apply them in the appropriate situations. So let's look at some of these strategies. We'll start with the analytical testing strategies, which are two of the most common. Requirements-based testing, where you analyze the requirements, identify test conditions from the requirements, and then cover those conditions with tests. And also risk-based testing, which is where you analyze the risks to the quality of the system and then create a set of tests to cover those risks. So basically, either the requirements or the test basis or the risks of the test basis, so you're identifying what you want to test, those being the test conditions, and then you're covering those. So what can we say about requirements and risk-based testing? So the benefits are that they are well aligned with the test basis, because it's derived from a defined test basis, because you say, these are the things I'm going to base my tests on. You analyze those. You can measure your testing against that basis. You can find defects in the test basis and remove those ideally before those become defects in code. And you can use traceability to show coverage of the test basis, so you can say what works and what doesn't. Now, if you are doing a requirements-based analytical testing strategy, you are going to need, of course, to have requirements, and the quality of the requirements will influence the quality of your testing. Risk-based testing is focused on stakeholders, and you will need to have the input of the stakeholders to figure out what those risks are. Now, what can go wrong? For a requirements-based approach, or analytical requirements-based strategy, the quality of the requirements, if low or missing entirely, or if constantly changing, that will create problems. For risk-based testing, then if you can't get the stakeholders to engage, then your list of risks will be incomplete. So you definitely have to have the stakeholders involved in these processes, in these strategies, especially for risk-based testing. And the thing that makes an analytical test-based strategy analytical is that the analysis is going to occur before software is delivered for testing. And this is in contrast to reactive strategies, which I'll discuss in a moment. So the next is model-based testing, model-based test strategies. There are basically two variants here of model-based strategies. One is non-functional model-based, which is where you use things like operational profiling to look at what the mix of users is and what they do at any given time, what percentage of users are doing what, how many users there are, etc. And then you use that to create a set of tests for reliability or performance, typically. There's also functional model-based testing, which is where you use universal modeling language, or UML, sometimes called unified modeling language, or UML, to model the functional behavior of the system, for example, business process models or state transition diagrams. And then the tests are generated from the models to test functionality. So in this case, you have to have a model. The model has to reflect the behavior of the system, the behavior of the types of inputs that you're going to get, the environment, and so forth. Ideally, this is going to be based on a study of actual situations that have occurred in the past. It can be based on anticipated situations, but that's going to be one of our risks, which we'll get to in a minute here. So the benefit of model-based testing is that it's going to allow you to test in a way that, if you get the model right, reflects real-world usage. But in order for this to work, you have to have a very accurate model of real-world usage, and you typically have to have tools to do this, both on the functional and the non-functional side. Tools are generally required to do these model-based testing strategies, to use the model-based testing strategies. If you don't have enough data to build the model, then the model will be incomplete. If you build the model in such a way that it's statistically inaccurate, especially for performance and reliability tests, you'll probably end up fixing a bunch of bugs that you didn't really need to fix, or not finding bugs that you actually needed to find. And either way, there's going to be problems. You could pick the wrong tools and not be able to properly implement your model using the tools. And with functional model-based testing, it's definitely possible that you're going to ignore some of the negative paths, they're called, the exceptional conditions and so forth, focusing on happy paths, the more positive kind of things that could occur, and thus your robustness, your ability to handle errors will not be thoroughly tested, and you'll end up having problems there. Stakeholder involvement is important with model-based strategies because you need to make sure that the key testing stakeholders help you validate the model, confirm the assumptions of the model, confirm the way the model works. Now, fortunately, a lot of times these model-based tests strategies involve constructing fairly easy to understand graphical or textual models of how the system is going to work. So getting stakeholders to engage in reviewing those is not, in my experience, too terribly hard. But you do need to get them to engage. Now, we also have what are called methodical test strategies. In a methodical test strategy, we have a standard set of test conditions, which we are going to exercise again and again. These test conditions, again, remember, test conditions, I just mean what we intend to test, not how we intend to test it. Those are the test cases. The standard test conditions can be derived from a quality standard like ISO 25000 or 9126. You can have a checklist. For example, one of the things that we cover in our ISTQB Advanced Test Analyst course is a checklist derived from Jakob Nielsen's book Usability Engineering for checking the usability of a interface on, say, a browser-based application or a GUI-based application. So that could be focused on that single test type. You could also have just a set of logical test conditions that you have derived from previous projects to say, hey, you know, when we test, we need to make sure that we remember to test these particular things. The thing that makes this methodical is that the test conditions are constant across the iterations in an agile or iterative life cycle, or releases in a sequential life cycle. So these are going to be constant. They might evolve slowly over time, but they're going to evolve mostly in reaction to things that have happened or not happened on past projects. So bugs that we missed, bugs that we found, and so forth. Now, what are the benefits of a methodical testing strategy? Well, consistently testing the things that we say we want to test. It's a checklist, right? So like any other checklist, it's very good at making sure we don't forget anything important. So it is a excellent part of a testing strategy to make sure that, okay, everything that's ever been important for us to test, we have this written down. We make sure we don't miss it. Now, it is, of course, essential that the list does evolve over time, so it has to be kept current in some way. Although it's, as I said, usually keeping it current is a matter of reacting to things that have happened. Because if you're trying to anticipate things that were going to happen and things that would be important to test, it would be moving you towards an analytical type of strategy. Obviously, the more stable the test object is, test object being the system under test, the more stable the test object is, the more applicable a checklist that has been previously developed is going to be, right? If the test object is changing a lot, then, hey, guess what? There's going to be issues with the checklist. There's going to be important things we'll miss and so forth. So this is the main risk, which is that your checklist is insufficient, your checklist is out of date, and so you end up missing important areas of your testing, or at least what you should be testing, and so you have gaps. In terms of stakeholder involvement, methodical strategies are pretty lightweight for the stakeholders because they are going to be involved in the initial definition of the test conditions, but for each subsequent release, you just need to keep track of the updates that you've made and let the stakeholders know, okay, these are the conditions that we're retiring because we don't think that they're applicable anymore. These are the conditions we're adding based on what we've seen on this release and so forth. Now, there are also what are called process-compliant test strategies. In a process-compliant test strategy, we are following processes that have been defined by somebody else, externally defined process. The processes can address documentation. They can address what your test basis should be, what your test oracle should be. Remember, test basis is what you're basing your tests on. The test oracle is the thing that you consult to determine whether your test has passed or failed. Processes can also address the way that you organize your test team and your testing activities, and alignment of the team and activities with the life cycle. Now, these do have benefits. So you are able to take advantage of the collective skills, wisdom, and experience of the people who created the standard. So if you're fitting testing into, say, Scrum, a Scrum XP hybrid Agile approach, you've got a lot of people out there that created the standard and that use that standard, and so you can follow along to this standard process. If you're following IEEE 829 or this forthcoming ISO 29119, there were a large number of people that were involved in creating that standard, so presumably the standard to some extent captures their skills, experience, and wisdom in terms of testing. That said, if the problems that the creators of the process or standard were trying to solve don't align with the processes that you need to solve, then it won't be a fit. Now, if there is good alignment there, great, no problem. This is going to work well. But if there's not an alignment there, if they were dealing with different situations than you are, that's going to be a problem. So if the people that created a particular process were building e-commerce websites, simple e-commerce websites designed to serve small businesses, and you're trying to build software that's going to be integrated into a complex system of systems and is going to be involved in administering healthcare to people, then you likely have a mismatch in the selected process, and that's likely to be problematic. So it's important that you understand the process or standard that you're trying to adopt, that you implement it appropriately, and that you understand the enablers and disablers associated with the different elements of the process so that you can fine-tune it as need be. The level of stakeholder involvement that's involved in process compliance strategies varies quite a bit. So if you're following Agile, the Agile processes, then there's daily engagement with the stakeholders through the so-called daily projects, daily stand-up meetings. The other kinds of standards actually might not prescribe interacting with the stakeholders, which might in fact turn out to be a bad idea, because it could very well be that the stakeholders feel like they need to be more involved, and since a standard doesn't call for that, then you might be keeping them out of the loop. Now, I mentioned reactive testing strategy. So what is a reactive testing strategy? In a reactive testing strategy, what we're going to do is basically react to the software when it's delivered to us. It's basically the opposite of an analytical testing strategy, in the sense that in an analytical testing strategy, we try to analyze prior to getting the software what we are going to need to test, versus in a reactive strategy, we look at the software we get and then we figure out what we need to test. Now, the difference between these two is not as stark as that might make it sound, because it's more of a spectrum than a pure black and white. Because what we're going to do is typically have some amount of structure, like James Whitaker's book, How to Break Software, that has what are called fault attacks in it, can be used as a way of doing reactive testing. Whitaker's book, Exploratory Testing, is another one that talks about how to do exploratory testing, and it gives some sort of predefined high-level test conditions that you'll want to look at. So there is some amount of structure up front in these, but the design and the implementation of the tests, creation of the inputs, the expected results, the data, the environments, a lot of that might happen as after the software has actually been received. Now, the benefits of these reactive strategies are that, being completely different than an analytical strategy, it will tend to find different defects than analytical strategies will find. So it's a great way to complement some of these other strategies, because it does tend to look in different areas. Because the upfront work is very reduced, the cost per defect found tends to be pretty low, so it's very efficient. Testing is continuously refocused on things, so that's another benefit of you're constantly refining your focus. There's a risk in analytical testing that you might continue to follow down a path that, were you paying enough attention, you would have realized is actually inconsistent with what needs to happen. Reactive testing is also very helpful in a situation where you have incomplete information about what to test. So if you don't get good requirement specifications or user stories, or can't get the stakeholders to engage in risk analysis and so forth, you can still carry out these reactive strategies. Now, the main factor for success here is that you need to have skilled and experienced testers, and those testers need to also have a good understanding of both the application, the business problem that's to be solved, and the technologies that are being used to solve it. So that's critical, and all too often what we see with some organizations is that they are signing up people to do reactive testing, and it's like, oh, this person has 6 months of experience as a tester. It's like, allow me to predict the future here. This person is not going to be a very useful resource for reactive testing, but nonetheless, they get assigned to do it, and that then can create some problems. So that's definitely something that you have to watch out for. So yeah, insufficient skill, lack of knowledge and of the system or the business problem. This is one of the major risks, probably the major risk. Another thing that makes it potentially problematic from a management point of view is unless you're very careful in terms of how you organize this and document it after it's happened, it can be difficult to say what you've tested. So I've seen this in a number of situations where you get people who claim that they have tested things using exploratory techniques and other reactive techniques, and then you're trying to drill into it and go, well, show me what you tested. Oh, well, I tested that. Really? Well, how do I know? How do I know how much you tested? There's not a lot of demonstrable coverage. Another thing that can be problematic here, and this is not unique to reactive testing, but it's particularly acute with reactive testing because you're designing your tests while you're running them, is you might find that that you don't have easy access to any reliable test oracle. In other words, when you're looking at a test result, it's very difficult to say whether that's a pass or fail. Now, this is partly throwing you back onto your skills and experience, your knowledge of the business problem being solved and so forth. To the extent that you have those good skills and experience, well, maybe you can rely on yourself as an oracle to some extent, but that can tend to lead to a he said, she said kind of scenario in evaluating the results and in dealing with bugs, because now we're in a situation where it's mostly a matter of opinion. Now, these techniques are used often in combination with the other strategies as a way of helping us make sure that we are checking for gaps. If we find a lot of bugs in areas that we didn't expect to find bugs in, using an exploratory or other reactive technique, we can go, aha, our analysis broke down in this area, but okay, we were saved by the exploration there. And it also allows us to take advantage of the skills, experience, and wisdom of the people doing the testing in a fun and creative way. Now, this next one, consultative test strategy, sounds a little weird. Basically, this is having somebody else tell the test team what to test. Some external stakeholder or stakeholders give the test team the test conditions to cover, and they're the ones, they say, this is what we want you to test. Now, it sounds a little weird at first, but actually, a sizable percentage of the effort expended in terms of, if considered in terms of total number of dollars spent on testing, a sizable percentage of that total amount of money spent on testing is spent on testing that is done following a consultative approach. And here's why that happens, because if you decide to outsource your testing to a testing service provider, you will probably tell that testing service provider, this is what I want you to test. You will give them the test conditions. That's fairly typical. So in that case, the testing service provider is following a consultative, or also called directed, test strategy. Now, the client is not following a directed test strategy. They came up with those conditions from somewhere else, but the organization doing the testing is following a directed test strategy. When I first got started doing testing, I was working in a compatibility test lab, and we would get lists from our clients of these are the configurations that we need to support with this particular application or operating system or what have you, and we want you to make sure that you've tested all of those. So they were giving us the conditions to cover. We were following a consultative test strategy. Now, the benefits of this are that the consulted stakeholders, whoever those folks are, get covered what they want covered. Now, in order for this to work, of course, the consulted stakeholders need to know what should be covered and what the depth of coverage should be in each area and what should be covered first and what should be covered last. So the whole effort allocation and prioritization, as well as selection of the test conditions, needs to be correct, which basically throws the consulted stakeholder, as I mentioned before, back onto the other strategies to figure out what those conditions should be. Things that can be problematic or troublesome with respect to these strategies when stakeholders have conflicting priorities and they bicker, can't come to an agreement. So there's no clear definition of what should really be tested. There's no shared definition. There's non-overlapping sets of definitions of test conditions, and then the test team gets spread very thin, trying to make everybody happy. And of course, you know, when you try to make everybody happy, you make no one happy. To the extent that the test conditions are wrong, in other words, the test strategy used by the stakeholders generated the wrong list of test conditions, just like in any other situation, you end up testing the wrong things. It is possible for the testing to proceed as directed for these test conditions without actually anybody noticing that, hey, guess what? We are going in the wrong direction. We're not really testing what needs to be tested most. And, of course, if you ask the wrong people, if the wrong stakeholders are involved, then you may satisfy them, but if one or more key stakeholders is left out, they're going to be quite peeved that they were not consulted. These strategies can be employed, though, within an organization. You can, as a test manager, say you're trying to figure out what to test. What you do is you make sure that when you come up with your list of test conditions, that you run that past all of the appropriate stakeholders, and that they have bought off on it and had an opportunity to make suggestions on what to add. So, again, this can be used as a way of augmenting the other strategies. And as I said, outsourced testing service providers are commonly use these strategies. And then we have the regression-averse test strategies. Now, what we're trying to do here is reduce the risk that something will be broken. So regression refers to something used to work and now it's broken. The sort of telltale sign of a regression-averse test strategy is an organization that's very heavily focused on doing a lot of automation. And this automation might be at the system test level, but it might also be at the unit test level. So, you know, agile testing often includes a strong regression-averse component in the test strategy, because we're trying to make sure that as we change things, we don't break stuff that used to work. Now, these when implemented properly, the benefits will include making sure that the risk of regression in key areas has been brought down to an acceptable level. It can be used successfully to support agile techniques, and so we can have quick releases of new versions if, again, this is implemented successfully. Now, what are important factors for success? Well, basically being able to implement a successful, efficient, maintainable automation approach at one or more levels of testing is what's critical for this, because any organization that I've ever seen that tried to pursue a regression-averse testing strategy without automation, got themselves in a real resource bind very quickly, because what happens is with each release, the scope of the regression testing to be done increases. So even if you've got a development team that's only, it's not very big and they're only building a certain number of features per release, notice that every feature that was ever built is potentially subject to regression. So if you've got this situation, then the test team has to grow in relation to the number of features added in each release, and eventually you're going to have 100 times more testers than developers just to try to keep up. So automation is really essential, which brings us to the risks that if you can't get the tools you need, or the tools don't really solve the problem, or you've got a situation where the tests are difficult or impossible to automate, then you're not going to, just from a pure feasibility point of view, you're not going to be able to implement the automation. Now, if you don't have the right people on the team to use the skills, then or use the tools, all the best tools in the world won't help you. So that can be another problem, is you've got the tools available to you, but you don't have the people that can use the tools. If the new features that are delivered to you show up in such bad shape that you have to spend a lot of time trying to beat them into shape, it can pull the effort away from doing the regression testing. So you may end up, existing stuff gets broken and you don't find it, or you get overwhelmed in all the other things that are going on. And similar to this would be, changing scope, where stuff is being added and deleted in a very wild and chaotic fashion from a feature point of view, and it's just hard for the regression test suite to keep up. So regression-averse strategies are an important part of most testing strategies, because people do want features that did work once to continue to work. In the case of agile methodologies, these are absolutely essential because of the rate of change. This is why you see a great deal of emphasis on building automated unit tests. Now, I think that there's an excessive level of confidence in a lot of organizations about the level of regression risk mitigation that automated unit tests are getting, but I applaud them for recognizing the fact that there is a lot of regression risk associated with making a lot of code changes, and automation is part of solving the problem. This kind of automation approach is made a lot easier by having a system that was designed to be automatable. The testability is very high. The programmers are involved in helping to select and build the test automation architecture, and they are involved in reviews of the scripts and so forth, so they know basically what not to do so that they can avoid breaking the automation, because that can be a real risk, and we've seen that happen with some clients where they had made a large investment in automation, and then the system was changed in a way which to the people making the change might not have seemed radical, but to the people who were running the tests, it was like, oh my God, you just broke all of our automated tests. Okay, so I've reviewed some of the most common strategies. There are perhaps others out there, but these are I think the most common, the ones that I've run across most often as a consultant and trainer, and the ones that I've used. Now, do you have to pick a single strategy? No. See, strategies, unlike schools, in a school you basically have to pick a school and be part of it, right? Remember the initial definition of, in a school you follow the doctrine or teachers, doctrines or teachers of that school. Well, here, no, you're not following anyone. You're not following any doctrine. You're not following any teacher. What you are doing is you are saying, okay, various useful strategies in different situations in which I find myself, I pick different strategies, just like Sun Tzu on the first slide. Right? Sun Tzu was recommending in these different situations you do these different things. So pick whatever strategies are going to work, blend them together. These different strategies complement each other, so don't just use one or two. Use as many as can possibly be practically applied in a given situation. If you look at some of the benefits offered by the different strategies, in many cases they balance other strategies' risks. So if you look at your situation, you look at the strategies available to you, you make a smart selection of the strategies you want to use, you figure out the proportion that you want to use, blend them together, then you will have the optimal probability of success. And you will, of course, have the satisfaction of knowing that, unlike a situation where you picked a school and then just followed somebody else's lead, you actually picked your own path and, as Frank Sinatra would say, did it your way. Excuse me. So don't use this test schools approach. Basically, in a test schools approach, you're selecting a single strategy. So what I'm suggesting here is let's just toss this idea out. There were some useful concepts in this, and in this concept of schools of testing. We should salvage those that are usable, but free yourself from this idea of the schools of testing to evaluate the other strategies that could work, understand the strengths and weaknesses, blend them together appropriately, watch for signs that you have made some bad choices in terms of strategy so that you can adjust, and make sure that you involve your stakeholders in this. So I always get a kick out of, I see people making these, posting these Twitter posts about, oh, testing is this and testing is that, testing is about this, and the goal of testing is that. Really? The goal of testing is whatever your stakeholders tell you they need you to do, because ultimately in testing you are in a service organization. So if you are adopting the right set of strategies, you will be serving the needs of your stakeholders. And if you are adopting the wrong strategies, you will be letting them down. So let the stakeholders be the ultimate arbiters of success in your choice of strategies. Okay, so as always, I will put the advertisement up here, and I will go to the question and answer pane to see what kind of questions we might have. So let's see. So Helen says, hi, Rex, great presentation. From what you were saying, we need to stop looking at ourselves and what we do and how, and refocus on why our profession came into being, helping our stakeholders, avoiding problems in production that cost them a lot of money. Yeah, absolutely. Or whatever. I mean, why, what, you know, we have stakeholders, right? And these stakeholders are funding us and involving us in their projects for some reason. There's something they want to accomplish. We need to understand what they want to accomplish, and then we need to stop and think about what's the best way to accomplish that, right? And the thing the problem that I have with this whole schools thing, and thank you, Helen, for helping me crystallize this, is that they start the discussion around how. They start the discussion around how to test. And what I'm saying is, no, that's completely wrong. We need to start the discussion around why. Why are we testing? What are we trying to accomplish with this? Because only once we understand the why can we then proceed to select the correct how. If we don't understand why we're doing what we're doing, then asking a question of how to do it, it's you know, if our conceptualization of why we are doing something is wrong, then how is the wrong question, right? If we believe that our job is to dig a hole in a front yard for who knows what reason, then of course we're going to say, oh, well, testing is about shoveling. Testing is about picks. Testing is about rock breakers. Testing is about mattixes. Well, maybe nobody wants us to dig a hole. Maybe nobody's asking for a hole. Maybe what they want us to do is rake. You know, maybe they want a level front yard, right? So, yeah, thank you, Helen. That really helped me put that into perspective of what I'm really getting at here is don't start with the how, start with the why. In fact, that was such a blinding insight for me that you helped me with, Helen, as I'm going to say, I'm going to write myself a note. Don't start with the how. Start with the why. Cool. Okay. Helen's got a follow-up here. I've recently heard the term factory testers, which I think means people that have been trained to do what they're told rather than think why they are told to do it. Have you heard this term? Basically, factory tester, Helen, is a term that context-driven, some of these adherents of this context-driven school made up to stick on people that they felt were mindless drones. And I do mean mindless drones, and that it is meant as an insult. So if you hear somebody talking about factory testers, factory school, that sort of thing, that means basically this person is one of these context-driven school adherents, and they think that they understand how to test, and everybody else has it wrong. And they've come up with 3 other categories of people, testers, that have it wrong in a particular way, and one of those is factory. So that's a good term to listen for, because it'll prick up your ears to say this is somebody who believes that the 7 principles of context-driven testing are what you need to know, and that he already understands the how, he or she. So yeah, good thing to watch out for. Let's see. So Yuri makes a point here. Rex, you use a lot of Kem Kahner's ideas, who is one of the founders of this context-driven school of testing. I would say that there are things that Kem Kahner and I will probably agree on. But there are definitely things that he and I disagree on. Some more so than others. So yeah, there are certainly things where I think he's got it right. And I'm not saying that anybody who considers themselves context driven, or who was at any point involved in this whole concept of context driven, should be completely dismissed and has nothing to offer. What I'm saying is that this paradigm of these schools of testing, where testing can be cut up into these 4 different wedges, and there's the good wedge, which is good for the 7 reasons that were discussed in Kem's book, and there's the 3 other bad wedges, which are all bad for various reasons that some of these guys really delight in hurling epithets at other testers for. I just think that is a completely failed approach. It's not moving our profession forward. In fact, it has created a schism in the profession, and has gotten to the point where people who are in this self-proclaimed context-driven school of testing don't listen to or talk to anybody else. So they've basically taken themselves out of the debate, and they're making themselves more or less irrelevant, because they're saying no, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is why you're wrong. I just don't think that kind of thing advances the debate at all. Let's see. Horna asks, what is meant by test-driven testing? Is that a strategy? Well, test-driven development is not really a testing strategy at all. It is a software development strategy advocated by people who are in extreme programming environments or extreme programming life cycles. And it's test-driven development and agile. Yeah, it's a development strategy that involves writing what are called tests, but are really executable low-level design specifications first, and then writing code to make those quote-unquote tests, which again aren't really tests, pass. It's a way of building code. There are proponents and detractors. Jim Copleen, a guy who's pretty big in the lean development field, wrote a guest article, which is posted on the RBCS website, where he took great exception, actually 2 guest articles, where he took great exception to test-driven development. So you might want to go take a look at that. Let's see. Yeah, Perna says, thank you, sir. So it's basically used in web methods and SOA testing. No, actually, it can be used anytime that Agile's being used. Test-driven development is something that could be applied. Daniel asks, what do you mean by test schools? How many are there, and who labeled them as schools? So the people who label them as schools are Kem Kaner, James Bach, and Brett Petticord in Lessons Learned in Software Testing, published in 2001. There are, according to them, 4 schools of testing, and as I've said, one is good, according to them. That's the context-driven school, which conforms to the 7 principles of context-driven testing, which are laid out in the book. You remember what I said about doctrines and teachers. And then there are the 3 other schools, and nobody claims to be an adherent of those schools as defined by them. Yuri made a point later, which I'll address, which is that, yes, there are people that refer to their organizations as testing factories, but trust me, those people are not owning the kind of derisive description of factory school that the context-driven testers will pour on their heads. What is usually meant if somebody if an outsourced testing service provider is describing themselves as a test factory, is they're talking about their ability to follow a consultative testing strategy and basically cover the conditions that you need covered in a very efficient way. That's what the implication of factory is there. The implication of factory-driven or test factory school of testing is, as I said before, very clearly from what the context-driven folks say, their implication is that is a band of mindless drones who are doing testing which is both inefficient and ineffective, and that is definitely not what anybody who's selling their test factory services means to imply. But anyway, yes, small number of people, 3 people, basically the founders of this concept in a book, set this out, and other people kind of glommed onto it over the years. But it all comes down to the 7 principles. And you'll know you're hearing somebody who is one of the adherents of this context-driven school of testing at a conference, because they will inevitably cite one of these principles, that it will come out verbatim, like a statement of creed. So this gets back to the point that I made earlier about a doctrine. Okay, let's see. I had so many comments about the slides not changing here. I'm having to navigate through them now. Hopefully you're all seeing this forcibly advance to the 21st slide. Let's see. So to address Yuri's comment, Rex, factory testing is not a bad word. I know a few organizations that use test factory term when describing their capability. Yes, I know, but trust me, Yuri, as I said, those people are not subscribing to the description of the factory school of testing that is put forth by the advocates of these 4 schools, because all of the other 3 schools are described in terms that are in no way complementary. And so that's test factory it's a coincidence. As I said before, an organization that's selling test factory services is generally offering to follow a consultative testing strategy and to do so in a very efficient way. Excuse me. Somebody asked here about PDUs. You will get an email identifying you as an attendee of this webinar, assuming that you attended it on a PC. If you did this on a mobile device, that creates problems because Citrix has a bug with that. So apologies for that. You have to attend these on a PC to get attendee letter, and in the attendee letter it says how to get the PDUs. Let's see. Helen says, I was told it was an insult. Factory testers are not considered in a positive light. Absolutely. It is intended to be an insult when it's used by anybody who considers themselves a member of the context-driven school. Let's see. Yuri says here, Rex, do you have any paper describing your disagreement with Kim? I like your ideas and would like to understand more about your disagreement with Kim. Well, no, I don't have a paper. The things that Kim and I agree on and disagree on would be very hard to characterize in a single compare contrast kind of slide. And I'm not, how to put this? I don't have such a big ego that I think that it would be time well spent for me to put out a position paper that's basically saying, here is where Kim is right because here's where I'm right because Kim agrees with me, and here's where Kim is wrong because he disagrees with me, which I think is what that exercise would devolve into, and is indeed what every presentation I've ever seen from anybody in the context-driven school contrasting their approach with other people's approach has devolved into. And that would just, putting out such an analysis would just feed the very idea that I'm opposed to here, which is this idea that there should be doctrines and teachers, in the sense that teachers in the sense that people to have to follow. I don't do these webinars for the purpose of attracting followers or convincing people that I am some sort of sensei and that they need to follow around and be a disciple of. I don't want that. I don't think that makes any sense at all. That does not move our profession forward. What I hope people take away from these webinars is they hear me throw out a bunch of ideas, and some of those ideas resonate with them, and they take them back and they try those ideas out, and some of those ideas that resonated with them work and some don't work, and they go, oh, okay, I picked up some interesting ideas from Rex, but at the same time realizing that, yeah, there's stuff that he said that didn't make any sense to me, and there's stuff that he said that made sense, but then I tried it and it didn't work. So, I just think that we would all of us in this profession would be far better served if everybody had a much humbler attitude about what we know and don't know about software engineering in general and software testing in particular, which is likely to be, given the relative immaturity of software engineering, pretty darn limited. When we get a couple hundred years out and software engineering has matured into a true form of engineering, then I think at that point, our successors will be practicing a much more enlightened form of testing, and a lot of what Kim is saying and what I'm saying and what the Bach brothers are saying and what people like Klein and other followers of the context-driven school are saying, and some of that stuff's going to turn out to be good ideas, but a lot of that stuff is going to turn out to be complete nonsense. And as I said, so we need to be really humble about what we know and what we don't know. All right, so I have a question here for Perna. Perna, if you submit a question once, trust me, it does show up. It takes a while to get to it. Let's see. What is the difference between project-specific test strategy and test management test strategy? Well, so there's the test strategy, which is a general pattern of how you go about testing from one project to another. Now, what you're referring to as project-specific test strategy, I would call the test plan. So the test plan is, here's how I'm going to go about implementing the strategy in this particular project. And of course, any particular project can vary from other projects just because of the way that it's the particular needs of the stakeholders on that project. Let's see. Helen says, I think non-testers sometimes talk about context to cut time in a project. For example, a project manager may ask for Agile in response to cut time in testing without understanding the impacts on delivery. Yeah, I think so. This conversation with stakeholders about what we do and why we do it and so forth needs to be a two-way street, right? Because the stakeholders are likely to advance some goals for testing that don't necessarily make a lot of sense. So we have to work with them to come up with a set of objectives that we're trying to accomplish that do actually make sense and that are accomplishable. So yeah, I mean, I'm not saying because notice that if all we did was let the stakeholders tell us what they need and then we go off and try to do it, then we're just saying, oh well, then the right strategy is always consultative or directed strategy. And what I'm advocating here is a two-way conversation with the stakeholders to clarify why we're testing to begin with. And if they have, unrealistic expectations, then we can help fix that. So Daniel asks, are there similarities with the context-driven philosophy in what you are sharing? I don't know. Philosophy, now you're getting off into it's almost like speculating on what the motivations were. And I don't know. I don't want to speculate on what James Bach and Kem Kaner and Brett Petticord's motivations were in 2000 when they wrote that book. I will just go back to something that I mentioned in one of the earlier slides, that a tree should be judged by its fruit. And then if we look at the outcome of what has happened, the outcome of what this idea of schools of testing has meant for the testing profession, then I believe that the evaluation is that it's been primarily a negative. And I do consider it to be a crowning irony that these folks refer to themselves as context-driven, but if you follow a lot of them on Twitter, some of the most prescriptive things that you will see said about testing come from the context-driven folks who say, testing is this and it's not that, and it's about this and it isn't that, and how do you know? Again, it's the starting with the how. So, to Robin says, funny, but in the plain meaning of the words, your presentation advocates true context-driven testing. Yeah, well, I got to agree with you, Robin. I mean, I think if we just do an English language interpretation of, use the right strategy for the right circumstance, then, yeah, I would guess that is context-driven. Maybe the difference is that, the difference is in who gets to say what the context is. And what I'm saying is that I, as the tester, have imperfect knowledge at best of what the context is until I have consulted with my various stakeholders and informed myself about what all the different perspectives are, and only in that circumstance could I actually say this is what the context is. So a couple of comments here from Yuri. It says, you and Cam have different experiences and you have different ideas about testing due to this difference. A paper, so it's the one that you mentioned before, the compare and contrast with the differences may help people who started their learning using Chem's books and want to better understand how to test in your context. Well, yeah, again, I would hesitate to do such an analysis because I've seen that kind of presentation done by the context-driven folks, and it just struck me as, when I saw it, exceptionally narcissistic and self-serving. I can't. There is no way that I can get out of my own head and try to stand back and be a fair judge of the differences between myself and Kem Kaner. No more could Kem Kaner could get out of his own head and be a fair judge of that. I mean, so all that he can do is put forward his ideas. All I can do is put forward my ideas. And as I said before, you have to gather up those ideas that make sense to you, give them a try, see what works for you, and go from there. Yeah, I mean, it's just I understand what you're asking for, Yuri, but I would have to be a robot, literally a cyborg, to be able to step away from my own head and try to carry out some sort of objective analysis of the contending opinions out there. And, you know, I mean, if I could do that, there was a fascinating story. I think this is Franz Kafka wrote this. I might be getting this wrong. It's called Judgment Day. And it was about this guy who dies and goes to Judgment Day and is surprised to find that the people sitting in judgment of him are three human beings and that God is called as a witness. God doesn't do the judging, and in the end, the guy is condemned to hell for some things he'd done. But he gets a chance to ask God a question, and he asks God, "Well, why were you the witness rather than the judge?" And he said the response was something along the lines of to understand everything, and to understand why someone did everything that they did would be to forgive it. You know, so I mean, I suppose if my consciousness were sitting in Kem's experience, I would probably agree with him. So I think you're asking for something, Yuri, that no human being can do, even though it's perfectly rational to ask for it. I'd ask for a dog that will live for as long as I'm going to live, but and I'm sure everybody can understand why I want that, but I don't get to have that. Helen says, laugh out loud, totally agree. Dr. Seuss Starbelly Sneeches. Oh, that's good. All right, so on that note of levity, which is, I think, a great place to end this, first off, a note of thanks to Perna and Yuri and others who suffered through the truly bizarre citrix bug, which for some reason afflicted you guys and nobody else. I've now learned how to avoid that. So a little bit more about our resources. We do run these free webinar sessions once a month. So sign it up at rbcs-us.com. If you want a special webinar presentation for your company only of this webinar or on any other topic related to software testing, please contact us, info@rbcs-us.com. You can also sign up for our regular free newsletter at rbcs-us.com. This will get you valuable discounts on consulting and training services and a regular newsletter with a featured article on RBCS and software testing and quality and so forth. We're on Twitter at RBCS, my own personal Twitter feed. At RBCS is the company one, at Laika Test Dog, Laika being the dog that the Russians sent into space. If you don't know how to spell Laika, look it up on the internet. Laika Test Dog. We're also on Facebook, RBCS-INC. Do remember to check your email over the next couple days. You might be the lucky winner of a free e-learning from RBCS. You were registered simply by attending this free event. Check out the digital library. Recordings of this webinar and other webinars, videos, podcasts, et cetera, will be posted out there very soon. And you can subscribe to our the RBCS channel on YouTube as well, and our recorded webinars are there. We offer these free resources as a service to the software testing community because at RBCS we are a not-just-for-profit company. This concludes the webinar. Thank you very much for joining us. I look forward to seeing you on future webinars.